Hello and welcome to Racing News 365 answers your fan questions from last weekend's Hungarian Grand Prix. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and joining me to answer your questions is none other than the awesome duo. That is 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Absolutely Coop, and the man, the myth, the almighty legend, that is lead editor Ian Parks. Gentlemen, we've got some brilliant questions as always to get through, but very, very quickly, Ian, it was a pretty stressful end at the Hungaroring.
In what way, Nick?
Well, in terms of the race, and you pointed out in our work Slack chat, you found the race really fascinating and enjoyable.
Sorry, that kind
because of the
stressful.
way.
I thought you was on about the workload that we had on.
No, not at all. Not at all.
We were a man down over the weekend.
We were.
Decided to go on holiday.
We
again.
were a man down, but
Hello,
no, it was. If you're watching this, but it was what it was. I mean, you said yourself you thought the race was fascinating, the way the strategies all played out. Explain your reasoning.
I loved it. You had a different strategy. You had the two guys on different strategy, and I do believe that might be one of the questions coming up. So I don't want to take too much away. And it was just how it all bubbled up to the surface and played right into the hands of the two guys going at it over the final few laps. I thought, for me, yes, we all love to see overtaking. Of course we do. It's fascinating, fabulous part of Formula One when a beautiful overtake is made. And we saw Max Verstappen pull off some beauties early on in that race. But nevertheless, when you haven't got that, and when you've got this strategy convergence of two different guys on opposing strategies and strategy convergence bubbling up towards the end of a Grand Prix, as it did, for me, I just thought it was fascinating to watch that time gap come down between Lando and Norris as well. And if you and I both said, Nick, Oscar's going to get Lando at about lap 60 or so. And he eventually caught up with him. I think it was something around lap 65, 66. Yeah. And of course, he had those two major opportunities a little bit too far back, Oscar thought, in terms of could have done with being another 0.2 different coming out of the top of the start-finish straight, but that bit closer to Lando. But nevertheless, I really enjoyed it.
Well, in a beautiful transition into the first question, which comes from Snorrelini. And in terms of the strategy, of course, Oscar had a 2-stop, Lando did a 1 and claimed the win. Sam, you can answer this one. Did McLaren favour Norris in the Hungarian Grand Prix strategy developments?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. It's a very, very good question because there's a lot of components to it, and you really kind of need to dive into it. So, if you look at it in terms of crudely, did it favour Norris? Obviously, ultimately, it did because he won the race from having dropped to 5th, then 4th once he dispatched of Fernando after a couple of laps. But obviously, the question is meant in the terms of was he favoured in that process, not in the outcome?
Yeah.
And no, essentially, because the 2-stop was the optimal, conventional strategy. Oscar was brought in around about the same time he was last year on what was the winning 2-stop strategy. End of lap 18, start of lap 19. And that was to undercut Charles, who was looking pretty comfortable in the lead. And it was only at that point that it became evident that the undercut wasn't as effective as potentially anticipated, because he obviously then wasn't able to get past Charles in that kind of 1 lap difference. It was only after that point that did Oscar ask about the 1-stop, and after the race he said that it wasn't really discussed amongst the team before the race. And also, was it then evident that Lando could potentially keep his mediums going to the point that he could then convert to a 1-stop strategy? So there was no intentional, let's favour Lando here. There was an opportunity for McLaren to get Lando back in the fight by doing something different. But that's only because he had fallen back and they could gamble. And to use Oscar's words himself, he had nothing to lose. Why wouldn't you roll the dice? Whereas he couldn't do that because he was very much fighting for the win in a conventional kind of 2-stop strategy fight with Charles at the time. So there was no intentionality behind it on McLaren's part. It was just the way it transpired. And one thing that we have lots of people have said over the course of the year, and we've said, is you want to see the variant, you want to see them try and do something differently. Ultimately, the team is kind of duty and honour bound to try and get their driver back in the fight. People talk about it being unfair that Lando was given one strategy, Oscar was given the other. you could counter that by saying it was unfair if they said, sorry, Lando, you've fallen back. We're not going to do everything in our power to see if we can get you back in the fight. So there is, balance there that you need to go and appreciate. And that offset won't always work. Sometimes it'll be Oscar who's given the alternate strategy and that works. Or sometimes it'll be a case of the conventional strategy does prevail. You've got to look at it across the season. And this time it just so happened that it favoured Lando.
Very well answered.
In the outcome. I should add, because I've used the words of the question there.
Very well answered. Let's move on to the next question, because it's about a driver you mentioned a couple of times, Sam. Ian, you can discuss and answer this one, and it comes from Darcy. Why did Charles Leclerc suddenly lose so much pace in his final stint?
Thank you very much, Darcy. And the question that I touched on in the F1 update on Sunday, because as we saw, Charlotte had fabulous qualifying, took advantage of the shift in wind conditions on Saturday during Q3, which landed him, to his own major surprise, pole position ahead of the McLaren guys, because it looked for all the world as if it was going to be a McLaren front row. As it turned out, Charles delivered a great lap and got the edge thanks to that shift in wind conditions. And then in the race, I think many observers were assuming that he would very quickly get swallowed up by both the McLaren guys, but nevertheless displayed great pace over the first two stints. And then, of course, we heard these rather curious radio messages from Charles about discussing things that had taken place that, he didn't want to have happened. And it was all very mysterious and very intriguing. And then, as we rightly saw, he lost considerable pace over the final third that ultimately not only cost him the race victory, but even cost him the podium, because he even finished fourth behind not only the two McLarens, but of course George Russell in his Mercedes. The intriguing suggestion from George was that Ferrari had deliberately raised their tyre pressures because they were worried about the possibility of illegal plank wear on Charles' car come at the end of the race, once it would then go through scrutineering. Was George correct? Was he just throwing us a bit of a curveball there? Both Charles and Fred said that it was actually chassis damage to the car. I asked Fred in his post-Grand Prix press conference as to, if they knew there was chassis damage, why was that not conveyed to Charles during that final stint to allay some of the angst and furore that quite clearly Charles was displaying in the cockpit of his car at various times with his radio messages? Fred kind of evaded the question a little bit and just said there was something going on with the car that needs to be investigated by the team once they get it back to the factory at Maranello. So it's a question, Darcy, of who do you wish to believe? Do you want to believe George and his theory that Ferrari did something with the tyre pressures on Charles's car because they were concerned about the possibility of illegal plank wear? Or do you wish to believe Fred and Charles that there was damage to the car and that's why there was such a dramatic drop-off?
Hopefully when we get to Zandvoort, or maybe over this week, Ferrari give us an accurate picture of what exactly the true issue was, whether it was chassis or something else. Hopefully we find out. But Darcy, thank you very much for your question. Moving on to the next one, and it comes from Chelsea. What is your opinion on Lewis Hamilton's current difficulties? Chelsea has also said that I would love to see his old form return, but I'm afraid it will never come back. We can quickly all give our opinions on this. Sam, do you want to go first?
I think a lot of it hinges on 2026 and the new era of car. The ground effect generation clearly hasn't, or Lewis hasn't gelled with this era of car. And that is something we've seen throughout his results over the last 4 years, particularly over one lap. He's struggled in qualifying. And let's face it, he is, very, very good over one lap traditionally. It's not like it was a weakness in his armory at any point in his career. So I think a lot of it is dependent on that. Also, moving team is a big upheaval. It's a big task, and it's potentially taking him a little bit longer or being a little bit more difficult to gel with the team than he potentially anticipated or other people may have expected from the outside looking in. But Ferrari is a very singular entity, and it's very different to the teams that Lewis would have been used to, be it McLaren, be it Mercedes. And so there's a little bit of a transition period that's going on there. So I think that's ultimately what's causing it. And you are then seeing Lewis living that out in a very heart on his sleeve type way. You can see that through what he's saying, across the season, but particularly Hungary was a fascinating snapshot in terms of that. Because, he was talking about, there'll be tears over the summer. He needs to release that emotion that he said is, very healthy. But also in the same answer was talking about how he loves the team and he's growing the camaraderie and how he's so committed to the team. And then over the weekend, then obviously then saying that the team needs to change drivers, which, let's face it, was an emotional response to very difficult circumstances at a track he's traditionally very, very strong at. So I think it all hinges on 2026 to get a real read as to where Lewis is, because you can cross sample across two different generations.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts sound pretty similar in that. I think for Lewis, he's just got to knuckle down now for the final 10 races, try and get a good result. But for him, full focus has got to be on next season, because if next season doesn't work, then you've got to wonder, is that then going to be the end of Lewis Hamilton? I think yes. I think if he doesn't have a good year next year, 2026 could be his final season. Only time will tell. But hey, but again, we've got to get to 2026 first. Ian, anything to add?
I think Sam answered the question really well. And in all honesty, Chelsea, I discussed this quite in depth on our podcast, which you can find on our YouTube channel. So please go ahead and listen to that. I did give a very, very long answer to this one. Personally, just very, very briefly, just to cap off this discussion, I think you guys know my opinion for a long, long time that we do have to get into 26 to determine really whether this is the end of, whether we are really coming to the end of Lewis's F1 career or not. We know he struggled with this generation of car. He's conceded it himself. And as I say, he's moved to a brand new team, brand new processes. Got to really get involved and embedded in that. We know he's trying to really implement his ideas and thoughts and impose those on the team as to the direction he would like to see it go, not only in terms of the internal development within the groups that are working there, but also the development of the car that he would like to see for 2026 in particular, because it is going to be a very different type of car and more energy managed car in many respects that we're going to see next year. So that's going to be a lot for every driver to get a handle on, not just Lewis. But I think we need really, about this time next year, I think we're going to have a really better idea as to whether Lewis has still got it or not.
Moving on to the next question, and it comes from Xander. Apologies in advance to any of the fan questions we're answering. If I've mispronounced your name, I'm doing my best as always. Anyway, the next question comes from Xander, and Xander, it's a bit of a long one, but hi. In recent podcasts, you have repeatedly said that Max Verstappen should stay with Red Bull in 2026 and potentially make a move in 2027, assuming Red Bull doesn't have a winning car. You seem convinced that Max would have his pick of championship contending teams, but may I point out a bit of F1 history? It's extremely rare for a driver to join a title-winning team during a period of stable regulations. That only really happens when someone voluntarily steps aside, like Nico Rosberg at the end of 2026, obviously for 2027. Is Max the exception to that unofficial rule? A really interesting question, I've got to say, so great one, Xander. Ian, I'll let you answer that one.
Thank you ever so much, Sander. But first off, obviously, we're not going to have stable regulations for 2026 because we're going into a brand new regulation set with new power units and new associated aerodynamics. As I've just mentioned, cars are going to be relying quite heavily on electrical power, 50% for next season. So it's going to be a very different type of car, very different regulation set. So it's going to pave the way to a lot of driver market movement towards the end of 2026, going into 2027. We know right now that Lewis has a 2-year deal with an option for a third with Ferrari. So there'll be a seat open at Ferrari at the end of 2026. We know that the Aston Martin drivers are both out of contract at the end of 2026. As for Mercedes, which of course is where we know that Max has most recently held discussions. We are awaiting news on what contracts both George Russell and Kimi Antonelli are going to be given going forward. But bearing in mind, Toto has already held discussions with Max and explored his options and what might be possible, bearing in mind the clauses that Max has in his Red Bull contract. The most recent one, of course, expired because Max goes into the current summer break not being in the top 3 in the Drivers' Championship. So that clause is now null and void. That's why Max is staying for 26. We know that there's probably more than likely going to be a clause in Max's contract that would allow him to leave at the end of 26, going into 27. So what options does that leave for Toto at Mercedes? What contracts is he going to give his drivers for 26 and beyond, possibly? You've got to assume he's going to leave something open that would allow him to pursue Max again in 2026, should there be a clause that could be activated that would allow him to join Mercedes for 2027. At this stage, Max will more than likely have his pick of teams 26 going into 27, depending, of course, on that clause in his contract with Red Bull for next year. Red Bull, of course, a very different entity next year because it's going to have its own powertrain in that car, which it's never done in its history. It's going to be a good one. I'm going to borrow Nick's phrase, only time will tell, but nevertheless, you have to assume, and James Vowles has actually said, he said it on Friday in a media session at the Hungary, that he's expecting a lot of movement, driver movement at the end of next season.
Moving on to the final question, and it comes from Mikey. Which circuit do you think, and I love this one, which circuit do you think would be unsuitable backwards? That's the kind of questions I like. It gets us really thinking. Sam, what track do you think would be unsuitable backwards?
Oh, that's a great question, and a fun one as well. This is enjoyable.
It gets you thinking.
This is a good way to round out the episode. I mean, there's lots, right? You've got to think about. Obviously, the curbs would have to move anyway, but if they couldn't move, I guess all the more unsuitable.
Circuit, I think if you nailed it down, Sam, every single circuit would be unsuitable because every circuit would have to be modified to be driven. But let's narrow it down to the most unsuitable.
Yeah, like the layouts.
Given the layout, because as I say, every circuit pretty much I think would be unsuitable.
I think I'm going to go. It's probably quite an obvious choice, but I think Monaco would be. I think it would be arguably more dangerous than it is from its, and obviously the speed's not great, not particularly high at Monaco, but as we saw in the F2 feature race this year, you can get a pile up of cars if things, happen in a certain way. But if you just kind of play it out, first of all, you get a really nasty concertina effect into what is usually the last corner. It's a really tight, twisty kind of section, which will be very difficult to navigate. So that's one thing that's going to be very difficult off the start, arguably more difficult than standard Vot is. And then, once you've got through the swimming pool section, which again would be very, very quick anyway, through the tunnel, I think it even gets even worse, the braking zone at what would be the end of the tunnel, because it's so much shorter than it conventionally is. And it's, it will be a sharp left-hander. So that's another kind of unsuitable, dangerous spot. But then also the run down to what would be the last corner, which is obviously stands at what, which is the first corner usually. That would be a really high speed downhill section into a very hard braking zone where I think you could see a lot of cars become unsettled and people going straight into the wall. So that is my pick for those three reasons. They're my three pillars for why Monaco is unsuitable backwards.
Well, is that what we need to make the Monaco Grand Prix exciting? Let us know in the comments below. No, for me, it's got to be Baku, Azerbaijan, because for the pure reason, can you imagine the castle section backwards going down? It will then be downhill. I mean, we see Charles Leclerc plant it in the wall pretty much every time we go there. I think we'd see most of the grid plant it in the wall going. I mean, it's tight enough as it is going uphill at slow speed. You'd be approaching that, a significantly high speed going. I think that'd be absolutely awesome to see. Ian, for you, where do you think would be unsuitable backwards in terms of the layout?
Okay, we've got Monaco and Baku. I'm going to say Spa for the obvious reason that I don't think you could do Radiant Eau Rouge going downhill. I really don't. I think that
you'd go airborne.
Yeah, exactly. Can you imagine doing the Kemon straight in reverse, going into radial over that crest and then down there. As you say, it's bad enough going uphill in an F1 car, even though they can all take it flat out these days. You know, F1 cars become so prolific in terms of the downforce that those cars are flat out these days. It wasn't like that back in the day, quite obviously, but going downhill, I mean, that would be extremely dangerous. When, you know, as I say, we've seen many an incident, very unfortunate incidents on a couple of occasions, quite obviously, going up Eau Rouge. But I just think it would be 3 times as dangerous trying to go down the hill in a Formula One car. Yeah, that would be very, 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 very difficult indeed.
I think that's a great question for our viewers to let us know your thoughts in the comments below. But obviously, let us know your thoughts for any of the questions that we've discussed in this video. But of course, that one, which track do you think would be unsuitable Baku, is a really cool question. Thank you to everyone who sent in your questions. Please be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel. And for myself, Sam and Ian, we'll see you in the next video. See you later.
Thanks for watching and listening. Take care as always, folks.
Thanks for joining us.